Hello, my name is Ana Castillo, and I am currently a student at SMU working on my master's in bilingual education with a specialization in special ed. For today's video, I will be discussing our first week of behavior interventions course. So I will be touching on some of the readings that we did, some of the lectures, as well as the videos that we watched that pertain all to Tier 1 interventions. I will begin by touching a little bit on things that I find interesting. I will also talk a little bit about practices that I used before and how I would modify them now if I were to go back to the classroom. And finally, I will close with my biggest takeaways that I took from this week's lectures and readings and videos. To begin with, one of the things that I found interesting when reading was that Sherman says that 20% of 9 to 17-year-olds have a diagnosable mental disorder. I found this very interesting for a couple of reasons. When I was watching the video where Birch talks about behavior interventions, she said that a Tier 1 behavior intervention will take care of 80% of your classroom problems or classroom management issues. So I thought that it was interesting to see that 80% of our students respond to Tier 1 interventions, and that Sherman said that 20% of students have a diagnosable mental disorder. So I kind of made a connection where it's like, well, maybe it's those 20% students that don't respond to the Tier 1 interventions could be one of those students that is not addressed in that 80% Tier 1 intervention. Another thing that I found interesting was that under the diagnosable mental disorders is ADHD. And one reason why I found this very interesting was because ADHD, I feel, is a term that gets thrown out a lot in the teaching world, in the education world. We tend to, any kid that is a little bit hyperactive or that has any kind of behavior problem, oh, he's so ADHD. That's one of the first things that we think about. But I feel that as teachers, we tend to not dig any deeper. We just say, oh, it's that and that's it. And I feel like it's very difficult for us to try to actually get to the core of the problem. And so I found that interesting because I feel like a lot of the times that's one of the problems, that we neglect to find the core of the problem or the core of the behavior to fully be able to address it. Another thing that I found interesting that when it talked about ADHD was that in a previous course I read a chapter that was by Irvin, Jones, Radford, and Greenridge, and the chapter specifically focused on ADHD. And one of the things that caught my attention and that I kind of connected to this behavior issue was that it talked about students that were diagnosed with ADHD, and it said that 20 to 30% of students are diagnosed with ADHD, and out of those 20 to 30% students, 40 to 60% of those end up developing a oppositional defiancy disorder. And when reading through that, I was going through the checklist, and I was going through the checklist because I have a nephew that currently has ADHD, and as I'm going through the checklist, everything is checking out. All those red flags that it says that potentially lead to oppositional defiant disorder, I'm checking off for him. And it's extremely sad because then I connect it to the classroom, and when connecting it to the classroom, I feel like in the readings, it says that a positive and a good Tier 1 intervention program a lot of the times addresses those small yet significant underlying issues or problems, behavior problems, that prevent from ADHD becoming an oppositional defiant disorder. And I feel that if we do have a good Tier 1 intervention plan in place, then it would definitely help us better identify and better address issues so that they don't get to be a Tier 2 behavior intervention, or they don't end up needing a Tier 3 behavior intervention. Another thing that I found interesting in our readings was that Banks, Abicor, and Sherman, as well as they discuss the importance of not just saying, oh, this child, or it's this child's behavior issue, or it's this child's that's not responding to intervention, but it says that a good behavior, in order for you to change behavior, you don't just have to try to change the child, but you have to change the teacher. And it doesn't mean get the teacher out of the classroom. It means that we have to look within ourselves to try to better address our behavior problems in the classroom. We have to be able to grow, and we have to be able to think about how we're addressing those problems, which kind of leads me into one of the articles that we talked about and that we read, which was by, it was called Culturally Responsive Behavior Systems. And it really made me think about the way that we address problems in different schools. And this article specifically talked about it's not enough to have a good behavior intervention program, but it needs to be a culturally responsive program. And it talks about how the way that you address problems and the way that you respond to a behavior issue is not the same way in all schools and areas. That culture does play a role, and it does play a part, and that in order for us to do that, you have to really get to know the child from the inside and the outside of the school. So we have to realize and address the fact that this child is coming with multiple behaviors from outside of the school, and that we definitely need to address that and take the time to get to know our students before we can try to correct a behavior. Because a lot of times these things are cultural, and for us to tell them, hey, look me in the eye, it's not them necessarily being defiant or being disrespectful, is that their background could potentially say, hey, to look an adult in the eye is dangerous. So I think one of the things that I would do differently if going back to the classroom would be to focus on getting to know the child all around versus just trying to fix a behavior issue, and take the time to actually build relationships and get to learn a little bit about that child's culture, where they come from, what they view as disrespectful or respectful. Another thing that I learned that I found very helpful, and I think that would have been very helpful when I first started teaching, was watching the Birch video where it discusses that behavior can be taught. Good behavior can be taught. And a lot of times teachers, we come in expecting certain behaviors from our students, but we neglect to be aware that, hey, we can't assume that these children have learned this behavior already. And so they talk about the importance of it and how it is important to be very explicit about our behavior. And not just that, but to be very positive about our behavior. That's another thing that really caught my attention, that a lot of times when I started thinking back, I remember that a lot of the times teachers, instead of saying, can you please walk? And I'm guilty of this, we would say, stop running, don't do that. And that's one thing that I really took away from this, was that make your response to a negative behavior positive. I read in an article that before the child gets to be over 1 year of age, they have heard the word no 10 times before they hear the word yes. So that negativity starts from the beginning. And that's definitely something that I would implement, not just in my classroom, but at home with my child. Because after doing that, I took a step back and reflected a little bit. And I started paying attention more to how I corrected his behavior. And I did realize that a lot of the times I was saying no, no, no. So I think that when I return to the classroom, and if I do, I will definitely make it a point that I state or restate or correct behavior positively. So instead of saying don't run, I would say, I would love it if you would walk, please, so that we can make sure, and this is one of the things that was addressed in our reading, that it said, so to say it and say what you expect from the behavior, how they can do it, and why it's important that they do that. So instead of saying don't run, I would say, could you please walk? I want you to be safe and not fall. So they know exactly what I'm expecting from them, and they know how to do it, and they know why it's important that they follow my directions. Another thing that I took away from everything in our lectures, including, was that behavior can be taught and that it can be changed, but it's also a lot of hard work. And it's not just a lot of hard work for our students, it's a lot of hard work for us as teachers, because changing a behavior starts with us, and that means that we have to change the way that we address behavior, and that we have to consider all factors that could be potentially affecting that child, which I thought is one of the hardest things to do, because as teachers, we feel that what we're doing is our best, and when we feel that it's our best and it's not working, we talked about this in class, we take it personal. And I think that that's very hard to separate the emotional aspect of it from the the professional, sorry, the professional part of it. And finally, another thing that I took away and that I think was very important was to realize that, yes, it's important to have that, but to make sure, yes, it's important to be explicit in what we're asking for our children, and it's important to realize that we need change from within, but that we're addressing everyone. And in one of our articles by, I believe it was Test, Kemp, Inman, Dingelman, Hitt, and Bethune, they stated that there's a huge gap in between children with disabilities and how behavior is addressed. And even a lot of the research and the evidence-based research and strategies that are out there, they neglect to include children with disabilities. So I think that it's very important that when we're looking for strategies that could potentially work, yes, use your professional judgment, but it's very important that we find database information and interventions that support the group of children that we're targeting. So if I'm going to try to do or try a behavior intervention on a child that has autism, then I should expect as a teacher that the interventions that I'm going to be looking for have been proven to work with children who are diagnosed with autism. And I think that's very hard as a teacher, because that means trying to include everyone under this little umbrella. And it's very difficult, but I feel that slowly, if it's something that we begin to take under account and kind of be cognizant about it, it will become easier. Overall, I thought that it was a wealth of knowledge that we received from this past week on Tier 1 interventions, and I am very excited to learn about Tier 2 and Tier 3, hopefully, and I know that I will be able to apply those to my personal life as well as my students' life. But for now, that's all that I have. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. Ask. If I don't know the answers, I will let you know. But I hope that you enjoyed it, and looking forward to making a second video. Thank you. Bye.